The Man in the Hallway. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. It was late at night, the kind of late when silence feels oppressive, and the air carries an eerie weight. I had just finished watching a movie and was heading back to my bedroom, walking down the hallway of my apartment. The lights in the corridor flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows on the walls, giving the space an unsettling atmosphere. The hallway was narrow, with old wood floors that creaked underfoot, the kind of sound that seemed to echo a little too loudly in the stillness. As I passed the bathroom, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks, but then it came again: footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the empty hallway. I froze. The only other person in the apartment was my roommate, but she was out of town for the weekend. My heart raced as I stood still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer, and I felt a cold chill rush up my spine. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the hallway. The space was dim, but I could see the faint outline of the hallway stretching out ahead. There was no one there. No figure, no sign of movement, just the shadows in the corners that seemed to shift with the light. I continued down the hallway, my pace quickening, feeling the presence of something unseen lurking nearby. The footsteps started again, this time from the direction of the living room. I spun around, staring down the hallway into the darkness. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking toward me, taking measured steps as though they were aware of my every move. But I couldn't see them. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed up slowly toward the nearest door, which led to my bedroom. I pressed my back against the door, my eyes never leaving the spot where the sound seemed to originate. For a few seconds, everything was still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught the faintest glimpse of movement, a shadow that flickered near the end of the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. It sounded like a door slamming somewhere in the distance, and I jumped in shock. I scrambled for my phone in my pocket, my hands shaking as I dialed my roommate, hoping to hear her voice, to prove that I wasn't imagining this. It rang for what felt like an eternity before going to voicemail. Panic surged within me. Whoever was in the apartment, whoever had been walking down the hallway, was still here. I wasn't sure what to do. The only exit was the front door, but I wasn't sure if it was safe to leave. The sound of footsteps was louder now, unmistakable and coming closer. I held my breath, waiting for the next noise, the next movement. Time seemed to stretch, the minutes dragging by like hours. It felt as though something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Suddenly, the hallway light flickered and went out. Total darkness enveloped me, my senses went into overdrive, and I could feel my skin crawl with dread. The silence in the hallway was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, shallow and rapid. I stood there for what seemed like forever, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, the footsteps started again. This time, though, they weren't coming from one direction. They were everywhere. Behind me, in front of me, on either side, like someone was pacing the hallway, just out of sight. I couldn't tell where the sounds were coming from, but they were growing louder, more frantic, as if the person was getting closer with each step. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard a voice, low, muffled, but unmistakable. "You're not alone." It was a whisper that seemed to come from all around me. I swung the door open and ran into the cold night air, my mind racing, my body shaking. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm my breath, but the feeling of someone or something still being with me, lurking just outside my door, never left. The apartment had been silent when I returned in the morning, but the memory of that hallway haunted me. I never found out who or what was in the hallway that night. I never heard the footsteps again. But the silence, the oppressive stillness, would always remind me that I wasn't the only one in the apartment that night. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still waiting for me to return. The apartment had always been quiet, too quiet at times. It was the kind of place that seemed perfectly ordinary during the day, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of the distant city fading into the background. But at night, something changed. The rooms felt colder, the shadows longer. There was an uncanny stillness that I couldn't shake, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The hallway, in particular, had always unsettled me. It was narrow, almost claustrophobic, with wooden floors that creaked loudly no matter how carefully you walked. The walls were lined with old, faded paintings, their colors dulled by time. The light fixtures were antique, their glass covers yellowed and brittle, casting a dim, flickering light across the floor. The longer I spent in that hallway, the more it felt like something was watching me. A presence, intangible and yet undeniable, seemed to lurk in the corners, just out of view. That night, I had just finished watching a horror film alone in the living room. It was one of those low-budget thrillers that was far scarier than it had any right to be, filled with suspenseful music and moments of unnerving silence. I got up to stretch, my body stiff from sitting, and decided to head to my bedroom. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I felt that familiar chill run up my spine. The creak of the floorboards beneath my feet was the only noise I could hear, and even that seemed too loud in the stillness. I paused for a moment, thinking I heard a distant noise, a slight rustling, perhaps, or the soft thud of something heavy. But I dismissed it as the house settling, a sound I had grown used to over the past few months. I turned toward the bathroom, which was at the far end of the hallway, and that's when I heard it again. A soft, deliberate step. It was almost like the sound of someone dragging their feet, the scrape of shoes against the wooden floor. My heart skipped a beat. My eyes darted toward the end of the hallway. There was nothing there. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, the hallway seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if it was pulling away from me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I had been alone for the entire evening, and the house was quiet. But then came the sound again, louder this time, closer. It was unmistakable. Someone was walking down the hallway. I could hear their footsteps growing nearer, slow and steady, the sound of leather shoes dragging across the wood, like they were deliberately taking their time. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure what to do. There was no one else in the apartment. My roommate had left for the weekend, and I hadn't seen anyone else since I'd come home earlier that evening. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if someone was there, but the words stuck in my throat. I was frozen, unable to move. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence filled the hallway. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but all was still. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to move. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. The light overhead flickered once more, and the hallway seemed to shift, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. I started walking again, my steps hesitant but quick, my back pressed against the wall as if trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps started up again, but now they were following me. The sound was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate rhythm, echoing through the narrow corridor. I could feel the weight of those steps, each one sending a ripple of dread through me. My heart pounded, my breath shallow, as I continued moving, each step becoming faster, more desperate. I reached the door to my bedroom, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. Just as I was about to open it, I heard something behind me, a voice, low and muffled, like it was coming from within the walls themselves. It was a whisper, but it was clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You're not alone." The words sent a jolt of panic through me. I spun around, my eyes frantically searching the hallway for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the same dimly lit corridor stretching out before me. But I could feel it now, something was there. Something was waiting. Without thinking, I threw open the door to my bedroom and slammed it shut behind me. I stood there, panting, my hands trembling as I locked the door. My mind raced. What had I heard? Was someone in the apartment? I fumbled for my phone and dialed my roommate's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my mind whirling. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence, the feeling of being watched, lingered in the air like a suffocating fog. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the aftermath of the movie, that it was just nerves. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The silence in the apartment grew heavy, oppressive. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floor, every distant sound, made me jump. It felt like the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, around 3 a.m., it started again. Soft, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. They weren't coming from the front door or the bathroom this time, they were coming from the living room. I could hear them moving slowly, methodically, as if someone was pacing back and forth, waiting for me to make a move. I could barely bring myself to get up, my mind screaming at me to run, to leave the apartment and never come back. But the thought of stepping back into that hallway, into the unknown, was even worse. What if the footsteps followed me? What if whatever was there wanted me to come out? The minutes dragged on, but eventually, the footsteps faded. The apartment grew silent once more. I stayed up the entire night, the sound of my own breathing and the beating of my heart the only noise in the room. The next morning, when I went to check the hallway, it was as if nothing had happened. The floors were empty, the shadows still. But the feeling of unease never left me. I never figured out what happened that night. I never saw anyone. I never heard the footsteps again. But the knowledge that something had been in the apartment with me, something that had walked beside me, lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who lived there. That whatever it was still out there, waiting in the darkness of the hallway. The days after that night blurred into one another. I tried to convince myself that the whole experience was just my imagination. Maybe I had been too scared by the movie, or perhaps the stress of being alone in a dark apartment had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had heard, and I knew the sensation of being watched wasn't something I could easily explain away. I began to avoid the hallway as much as possible, spending my time in the living room or the kitchen, trying not to think about it. The apartment still felt cold and strange, though. Every time I walked past the hallway, I felt an overwhelming urge to hurry, to get past it as quickly as possible, as if the very air there held some invisible threat. I started to notice little things, like the way the temperature seemed to drop whenever I entered the hallway. The chill would sweep over me in an instant, the cold sinking into my bones as I passed by the bathroom or the living room door. And there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I would hear something, a soft scrape of a footstep or the quiet rustling of fabric in the dark. It wasn't just the sounds that unnerved me, though. It was the way the apartment seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention. There were times when I would leave a room, only to find something out of place when I returned. A chair that had been facing one way was now turned slightly toward the window. A book that had been on the coffee table was now lying open on the floor. I tried to tell myself it was just me being forgetful, that I was imagining things, but the small inconsistencies continued. They were too frequent to ignore, too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. One evening, a few days after the incident, I had finally gotten the courage to walk down the hallway again. I was determined to face my fear, to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. I turned on the hallway light, its faint glow casting long shadows across the walls, and began walking slowly toward the bathroom. My steps were careful, measured, and the floor creaked underfoot as if protesting my presence. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, refusing to glance at the corners where the darkness lingered, but I could feel it there, something, or someone, in the quiet, waiting. I reached the bathroom door and placed my hand on the knob. Just as I was about to turn it, I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were coming from the living room. The soft, rhythmic sound of someone walking, their footsteps slow and deliberate, like they were just outside the bathroom door, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps didn't stop. They continued, steadily approaching the bathroom. I could feel my stomach turn as the realization sank in. I wasn't alone in the apartment. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I turned the bathroom light on, but the sudden brightness only made the shadows in the hallway more pronounced. The air felt thick with tension, like something was waiting to reveal itself. The footsteps stopped. Silence, oppressive and heavy, descended. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hoping I was just imagining it, hoping it would all go away. But then, from behind me, I heard a whisper. It was low, barely audible, but it was clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there, nothing but the empty hallway. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could feel it, a presence that was just out of sight, standing right behind me. I backed away slowly, my pulse quickening, my body trembling. In a blind panic, I bolted from the bathroom, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran back to my bedroom. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning, and the air felt thick, like I was suffocating. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone was on the nightstand, and I was too scared to move. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything to happen. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and unease. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. Every creak, every whisper, every rustle of fabric felt like a warning, a signal that something was getting closer. But by morning, the apartment was silent again. It was as if the night had never happened. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of any presence, no footsteps or whispers. But I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, hiding in the shadows, watching. I tried to ignore it, to go about my day as if everything was normal. But as time passed, the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. It wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It was everywhere I went. The apartment felt oppressive, as though it were alive and aware of my every movement. The air grew heavier, the shadows more pronounced. I began to avoid the hallway entirely, taking the long route through the living room and kitchen just to avoid passing it. But no matter where I went, the feeling never left me. It was like the presence had followed me, lurking just beyond the corner of my vision. A week later, I decided to take action. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. I contacted a psychic, hoping for some answers, some way to understand what was happening in my apartment. She agreed to meet with me that evening. When she arrived, she didn't ask many questions. Instead, she walked through the apartment, her eyes scanning each room as she murmured under her breath. I followed her, feeling both skeptical and desperate for any explanation. When she reached the hallway, she stopped suddenly, her face going pale. She turned to me and whispered, "There's something here. Something old. It's attached to this place." I could feel my heart sink. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. The psychic didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dark corners of the hallway. Finally, she spoke. "It's a man. He's trapped here. He's not at rest." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What does he want?" The psychic hesitated. "He wants to be seen. He wants to make his presence known. And he's not going to stop until you acknowledge him." The words sent a wave of dread through me. I felt my skin crawl, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the footsteps, the whispers, the cold air, they were all signs of something trying to reach me, something desperate for attention. The psychic suggested a ritual, a way to help the spirit move on, but she warned me that it wouldn't be easy. It would take time and patience. And even then, there was no guarantee that the man would leave. But I knew I had no other choice. I had to try. That night, I began the ritual, my hands shaking as I placed candles around the hallway and recited the words the psychic had given me. As I spoke, I could feel the temperature drop, and the presence in the hallway seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive. The footsteps returned, but this time, they were faster, more agitated. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The air shifted, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The temperature returned to normal, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to recede. The spirit, the man in the hallway, was gone. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt empty, truly empty. No footsteps, no whispers. Just silence. But I couldn't forget the man in the hallway. Even after the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting, watching. And I wondered, had he truly left, or had I simply convinced myself that he was gone, when, in fact, he was still hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to return. The end.